Okay, guys, like always, just a pleasure to be with you guys, to bring God's word, to get some encouragement, to most of all just have our lives transformed by the word of God. Today we're going to be going over all of Psalm 46, so if you would turn there with me, I'm going to read the entire psalm right now, and then we'll go through it more verse by verse. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. Selah. There's a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Selah. Come, behold the works of the Lord. He has brought desolations on the earth. He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Selah. Thus reads the word of the Lord. So today I have 3 points for us to get at in regards to God as our refuge and strength. We have the reason, the resources, and the result. And we think of the idea of refuge, and it's a very dated idea. Refuge, we very well might think of a castle, a stronghold, some kind of citadel. We might even think of like the Lord of the Rings and Helm's Deep, things like that. And one of the things that one of the things I was just thinking of was the movie The Last Castle, which is actually the title for the sermon as well, called The Last Castle. It's a movie starring Robert Redford, in which he's imprisoned in a prison that was believed to have been a castle. And at the beginning, middle, and end of the movie, he says the same speech 3 times, saying what makes a castle a castle. He talks about its fortifications, how it would have been on a hill so it could see all the enemies coming, that it has a garrison, that it has people to protect the people within it. And he just breaks that down time and time again throughout that movie. And as we would think of that idea, it doesn't make a lot of sense to us. We don't use castles in modern warfare. For any country to claim power because they have a castle, regardless of how great or awesome it is, it doesn't make any sense to us today because we have weapons and battlements and fortifications that consistently will beat castles out in every possible way. And I think Christians today have the right to say that we have the last castle, we have the last refuge and strength. We have one that has not passed away. All the great castles of history have all been conquered at some point or another. They're laying in ruins. They've all been destroyed, but we have a refuge that has lasted forever. And I think it's important that we know why we have that refuge, who our God is, and what that actually means in our lives. So as we get to the reason for our refuge, let's just be mindful of the importance that we have a place for safety. Verse 1 says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. This statement is a statement on which the entire psalm continues to build. It's a key statement. It's a very bold statement. But it's also a claim that most of us would probably take for granted. Meaning that I think a lot of us fail to realize the connection that verse 2 makes. The psalmist has made the connection between his head and his heart. And I would question how many of us have actually made that connection of knowing that because we have a refuge and strength and a very present help in times of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. We have a claim, and we always have to ask, what's the therefore? Because God is our refuge and strength, we will not fear. Though all these afflictions come upon us, though all these afflictions come upon Israel, they will not fear. Not because of their own strength, not because of who they are, but because of who our God is. There's an idea here of the earth giving way, and in California that's a very real issue. We have a lot of earthquakes, and at times we've literally had the earth give way. I think that is a very reasonable understanding of this passage, but I also think it's more than that. The issue with poetic imagery is it's sometimes hard to understand what is poetic and what is not. And I believe that the imagery is double-sided. I think it's both literal and physical, speaking of just a turmoil in life that can come upon us. And specifically in verse 3 it says, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. I don't think this is merely speaking of physical waters, of physical floods, although I do think it does mean that. Isaiah 8:5 speaks of the Assyrian army coming upon Israel as a flood. And flood imagery is consistently used throughout the Bible in reference to a strong opposing army. So though it's not clear that there is poetic imagery intended here, I think through the consistent use of the word sea and oceans being used to describe an enemy force, I don't think it would be wrong for us to immediately think of that in this context as well. So the reason that we need not fear when all these afflictions come upon us is because God is our refuge. He's our present help in times of trouble. And so then from there, we get to point 2. We get the resources. And so it's one thing to say that we have a claim. And the claim at some point, so we've had the claim and we've had, what does this then mean for our lives? So we won't fear when these things happen. But the claim gets more substantiated. It's what is God doing that gives us that comfort and peace, that validates the claim of Him being our present help in times of trouble. So verse 4 says, there's a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. There's a lot of interpretive controversy around this, whether this is referring to Jerusalem or Zion or other places entirely, because we don't know the historical background of Psalm 46. We merely just don't know what it's actually referring to here. And though this might be a controversial statement, I would like to say that there's a certain amount where I don't think knowing which one it's referring to. Is it referring to Zion? Is it referring to Jerusalem? Is it referring to something else? I'm not sure that that entirely matters. And I can stand to be corrected on that, guys. But I think what it really matters here is that it makes glad the city of God. It's a provision for us. That's what it's getting at here, that God, it's not just our refuge and strength, it's going to validate it, that He's provided this resource for us. And it's the most valuable resource He can provide for us in a physical sense of the idea. And I think that imagery is important because we can go roughly 40 days without food and survive, but we can only go 3 days without water and live. It's the most important resource we could have in fighting a battle. Hydration is key. And I'm not saying that this is a literal water in our lives today, but talking about the New Testament, Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman saying that there's a spring of living water that if you drink from, you won't be thirsty again. I think that would be the modern application of this, that we've been given the Holy Spirit, that there's a source in us that makes glad the city of God. And I think with all we should strive to get the historical background of every text that we look at and to strive for it accurately. But in the midst of controversy, in the midst of a lack of clarity, I think we can still find comfort in what this is talking about is God supplying us with the necessary resources to fight this battle. And it's not just the resources for our physical provision. Verse 5 says, God is in the midst of the city, and that she shall not be moved. And God will help her when morning dawns. From a purely physical perspective, in a combat situation, in the midst of affliction, you always want to have the commanding officer present. And as war has changed throughout time, that's becoming an increasingly less popular idea. You go back to the Civil War, and you had generals on the battlefield. You go back to the Revolutionary War, you had generals on the battlefield. That's not so much a thing anymore. They've learned to protect ranks. But that's not the God that we have. We have a God who's with us in the midst of our struggle. He doesn't commit an act of self-defenestration when he sees the trials coming. He stays with us. A great illustration of this is Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, especially during the fight of the Iadring Valley. It was a revolutionary idea, air cavalry, that they would be dropped in, not knowing necessarily where the enemy was, try to establish a position, and just gain intel on the enemy. That's what he did one day in the Vietnam War. There's a book about this, and there's also a movie about this called We Were Soldiers Once. That's the movie title, and then for the movie title, it's We Were Soldiers Once and Young Too. Great, absolutely recommend both of those. But Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore made a promise to his men. He promised them that he would be the first man to step foot on the battlefield, and that he'd be the last man to step off of it when the fighting was done. In the midst of this battle, it was very bloody. He actually had to issue the call to the artillery saying broken arrow, meaning that the American position was about to be overrun. And he had been called from headquarters saying that you need to come and brief us. And that was just an excuse to get this colonel off the battlefield. He didn't think that that was a good enough reason to get him off the battlefield. He stayed with his troops. In the midst of his position being overrun, in the midst of an artillery strike being called in on his position, he stayed with his troops. He understood the importance of having a commander in the field. Ultimately, they were able to survive that situation, and he continued to lead his men for another 2 years in the Vietnam struggle, always being the first man to step foot on the battlefield and the last man to step off of it when the battle was done. That's the kind of commanding officer that we have in the trials of our lives. We don't have a distant commander who's commanding us over radio. We have one who's present with us in our struggles, that we have that stronghold with us. Verse 5 continues to say that God is our help in the morning or the dawn. This passage was really hard for me to get at, because it's why is it specifically in the morning? Why not help in the night? And I think there are two ideas here that help with our understanding. One, throughout this entire psalm, it's packed with Edenic imagery. It's really hard to look at the psalm and to not understand the Edenic imagery intended. And one of those things is that God created light out of the darkness. Darkness has tended to bring chaos, especially in those times. They didn't have infrastructures with lights on the highway or things like that, flashlights, phones. We have flashlights on our phones now. Like we just have so much light in our lives. But in those days, if it was dark, it was dark. They had torches and candlelight, nothing to light a significant area. And it brought chaos. You couldn't travel at night because you could get lost. It was a significant issue, and there were just dangers. So there's the argument that it's because of the dawn, because God is the dawn in the creation of the sun. The other idea is that attacks tended to happen in the morning. That was when most attacks would begin, was in the morning, because that's when light gave the availability for the attack to begin. So what I believe this is saying is that God's going to help us when the attack begins. At the time of the attack, the dawn was when you could see the enemy forming around you. You could see that they made a battle plan of attack, and you could start getting your garrison ready. That is when God's going to help you. This isn't to say that God's not helping us prepare now. He's given us the tools. He's given us the resources to be prepared, to be well-nourished, to even be of good morale as we're preparing for these fights. But God's divine help is ever present with us as the enemy begins to attack. And how does God protect us in these times? Or how can he protect us in these times? Verses 6-7 says, the nations rage and the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. The thing that I want to draw us into on here is he utters his voice, and that is enough for the earth to melt. Consistently throughout the Old Testament, we see that God's voice is enough to bring fear into the mightiest men, that it can make actions beyond our wildest dreams occur. With 3 simple words, God created light. Let there be light. He has the power of creation in his voice. From a fundamental perspective, creation is harder than destruction. It is far easier for a building to be left alone and just destroyed by the elements than to have an idea of a tornado coming through and a building just being there. It's a much harder process to create than to destroy. If God has the power to create in his voice, how much greater is the power of destruction in his voice? A far simpler task. God doesn't need to call down the legions of angels to fight for us. God merely needs to speak the words, and the nations will fall before Israel. They fell before Israel. That's the power of our God. He doesn't need the physical action. His voice is enough. That just speaks to the power of the God who we have as our refuge and strength. Verse 7, it reminded me immediately of the song, the God of angels' army is on our side. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Consistently throughout the Old Testament, we just have an example of God being a fortress for his chosen people. We'll get into further examples later on that will further explain that passage. So we've had the reason, we've had the resources, and now we have the result. Verse 8 begins by saying, "Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth." This is a call for Israel to just remember all that they have been established by. In the midst of whatever struggle is going on here, whether it be an attack and siege on Jerusalem, or whatever's going on here, because again, we don't know the historical context of Psalm 46, it's for them to realize what their God has already accomplished for them, and to take comfort in that. He has consistently delivered what he has promised on their faithfulness. As in, when they have been faithful, God has been faithful to fulfill his promises. And the promises don't begin with each individual battle. It's not, God, I'm going through a battle right now. Will you get me through this? Verse 9 actually makes a very good connection for us. He'll make war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. This statement is actually believed to be a foreshadowing of the end times. That God is the ultimate peace, and at some point we are told in Revelation that he will bring all wars to an end. And we see in verse 9 that when he breaks the bow and shatters the spear, the way that's in the Hebrew is he will destroy all weapons of war. That he'll destroy the chariots of fire, all the siege wagons, anything that can be used in war, he'll bring to an end. He'll bring about that peace. And that's speaking to the end times. That's speaking to the ultimate coming of Christ, as we would believe. But there's a way. God is in control of all the wars that are going on in our lives. This could be national crises. This could be social turmoil. And guys, I don't know about you, but I would claim that God is our refuge. But it's in the midst of looking at this verse that I was... So something was just brought to my heart, that is, how much do I trust that? Because as the riots happened recently, and I don't live anywhere near a place that was looted or anything, I'm probably 10 miles from the nearest store that was looted, I wasn't trusting in God. I was trusting my 12-gauge shotgun that I slept with a pistol in my bed. That's what I was trusting with. And I'll be honest, when my parents were gone for a vacation during that time, so I was home alone. Everywhere I went in my house, I carried a gun with me because I was scared of the civil unrest. Not realizing that God was sovereign over that. And obviously, I would have claimed those truths in those moments. But I didn't realize in my heart. In my heart, I was trusting my physical ability to defend myself. And it's really cool because in verse 10, it speaks to the idea of our protection not being for our own glory, not being in our own self, but in being in God. It says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress." Israel was rarely a significant nation to be messed with. It was often a very small nation. One of my professors for my OT class, he put up a map consistently to give us an idea of where the nations were at the time that things were being written. And the warring nations, the bigger nations, Babylon and Assyria, he put on the map as cats. And the smaller nation he puts as mice. And Israel was almost always a mice. Israel's ability to win wars was never supposed to be about them. It was supposed to be about God's glory. We know that we have a God who's jealous for his own glory. And even in his sovereignty and protection over us now, it's not designed to be something that glorifies us of, look at how good we can handle these tasks in the midst of a family member dying, a daughter struggling with cancer, a job loss, societal unrest, and just how firm we are that our God is sovereign over that. That's not supposed to be something that people can look at and be like, you know what, Matt, he didn't cry once when his wife was diagnosed with cancer. He's just such a strong man. Matt didn't cry once. It's because he's a Christian. He knows God has a plan for this to work out for his betterment. It's to glorify God. And Israel's inability to do anything by themselves is so important. In 1 Kings 17, we're given a prescription of what Israel's needed. And they're told to not acquire mass amounts of chariots or wealth or money, the things that would help them do it on their own. All those things were futile. Whenever Israel went and disobeyed those things and they tried to do it on their own, they were conquered. They didn't rely on God. In the same way for us, that when we don't rely on God as our shelter and strength, we fail. So often when we're faced with challenges in our lives, we try to do it ourselves. We come up with our 3-step plans. This is how I'm going to get through this challenge in my life. This is how I'm going to deal with this semester in school. This is how I'm going to deal with this family member dying. We set those things up. We even have, and I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, we even have like the stages of grief. We set these things up so we know what to expect in our lives. But when we try to do that and we fail, it's sin. And I don't think we treat that as seriously as we should. It's a sin of self-reliance. It's a sin of pride, not immediately going and trusting in God. And none of us will ever be able to do this perfectly. But so many of us fail to do this at all. So many of us will just go out and try and fail and trust in God. And then we trust in God. We use him as a secondary source. We commit sin first. And God will do that. God will break our legs. He will force us we will be forced into our humility to realize, I can't do this. I need God. And that's a good point for us to be in. But how many times do we have to try something on our own for us to finally realize that we have a great refuge in our God, that we need not fear when trials come our way because we have a mighty refuge in our God. My exhortation for you guys today would then be this, that you guys don't lean on your own strength to get you through the trials, regardless of what those trials may be, but that you would first and foremost seek to rely on God in his strength, in his knowledge, and lean not on your own understanding. Amen. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. Shut this off. All right, Evers.